Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. None of the Above is a political program where we examine why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized, and we always want to have solutions. No sense talking about problems if you're not going to talk about how to solve problems. And this is one of my favorite weeks of the year. It's the Aspen Ideas Fest, and we have these great scholars coming to Aspen, and I always peruse the guest list and figure out who I can twist their arm to come on the show. And we've already had some great shows this week, so if you haven't seen them, hopefully you'll catch up. One of the themes that I started this week is not just looking at our dysfunctional and polarized system, but maybe looking past that, outside us, to see what's going on. There's a lot of discussion lately about how democracy is on the decline. And yesterday we had an interview with Mike Abramowitz from Freedom House, who studies this issue and in fact is saying that democracy's been on the decline worldwide for roughly the last 12 years. And I'm concerned about this. Our democracy has its own issues, but I think we have to also understand what's going on around us in the rest of the world, and that's one of my themes this week. So lo and behold, I was going through the list, and there's Professor Sherri Berman from Barnard College, and she's about to publish a book called Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe. Now, maybe you can't connect those dots, but I can, because from what I've read, you've got to understand democracy and dictatorship in Europe if you want to take some of the next steps to understanding dysfunction, polarization, and other things. Now, the book isn't out yet, so you're going to have to write it down now, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, and about a month from now you can buy the book. But we're going to talk today with Sherri Berman, who's the author, and we're going to drill down and understand why we have to have some context for this conversation. So, Sherri, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So there's an old expression, something like, if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat them, right? And one of the things I have read from reading your materials is you cannot look at democracy in 2018 or 2010. You really have to look at democracy over a much longer period of time to understand the evolution, and in the context of that evolution, the ebb and flow of it. And then maybe you can then look to 2018 and see where we are in 2018. So without giving one answer for 25 minutes about your whole book, take us back a little. And teach us what we need to understand about the evolution of democracy if we want to have a conversation in 2018.
Okay, great. So let me perhaps start with your introduction, which is taking up some of the data or some of the conclusions of the recent Freedom House report.
Okay.
So one of the things that the Freedom House report pointed out was that over the last 12 years there's been some erosion both in the number of democracies worldwide and in the quality of democracies worldwide. And that is definitely something that we should be concerned about. From a historical perspective, however, I think it's important to note that we have more democracies today than we've ever had in the past, with the exception of that last decade or so, and that we've had much less democratic erosion during this last democratic wave than we've had during previous democratic waves. So if we look at times in the past when we've had lots of countries make transitions to democracy, 1848, 1918 after the First World War, 1945 after the Second World War. We've had much less decline in the number of democracies during the late 20th and early 21st century than we've had then. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned, but it does mean that if we think historically, the reason why we use the term wave is because, as anybody who's ever experienced a wave knows, it comes in and then there's an undertow. And so historically, this has always been the case, and there are reasons for that. It's not just a statistical correlation. There's a causation underneath that that analogy. So we can get back to that. And I think,
and we're going to get back
and
to
we're
that.
going to get back to that. And I also think that if we look at this historical development and decay of democracy, one of the things that we realize is that in places where it has been, at least until recently, fairly stable, and we're talking here about North America and Western Europe, that it took hundreds of years to get that way. So if we start our study of modern democracy with the French Revolution, which most scholars do, recognize that it wasn't until after 1945 in Western Europe that we actually got stable democracy. There had been many democratic experiments before that during the 19th and early 20th century. Almost all of them failed. So remember that for Western Europe, it took, again, over 150 years until we began to even think that liberal democracy was something we could take for granted. In the United States, we tend to think of our history as one of uninterrupted democracy. But in fact, using the kind of criteria that Freedom House uses or political scientists use more generally, the United States would not be considered a full liberal democracy until at least the 1960s. Why? Because a significant number of our citizens were kept not only from voting, but from many of the liberal rights that are enshrined in our Constitution. So we would have been considered by Freedom House's criteria, and by, again, the criteria of political science more generally, not to have been fully democratic until the 1960s. And so, again, I think a historical perspective enables us to kind of step back from the current day and recognize, A, how much difficulties liberal democracy has always had, and B, to think about what the actual problems today are.
So what is your definition then? You're a professor. What would get a country an A in democracy? What do you have to be fully democratic?
So I think it's important to consider both parts of that. Okay, so liberalism and democracy actually speak of two very different things. And historically, they have not always gone together. And one of the things that we're seeing today is their separation in many parts of the world, Eastern Europe, most notably. Okay, so democracy means essentially free and fair elections. People get to choose their leaders and governments through a vote. That's what distinguishes it from dictatorship. In dictatorships, leaders are chosen by hereditary means, by nepotism, by an oligarchy, or by force. Okay, so democracy means people choose their leaders and governments. Liberalism is something very different. Liberalism is about individual rights, it's about individualism, it's about checks and balances, it's about minority protection. And in fact, again, up until 1945 in Europe, and one could arguably say the 1960s in the US, those two things did not coincide in the West. So an A in liberal democracy, which would be the highest score, for instance, that Freedom House gives, means not just free and fair elections, but full protection of individual rights, minority rights, rule of law, separation of powers. So that's a pretty expansive list of criteria to sort of score an A on the liberal democracy, in the liberal democracy category.
And that's interesting, because I was reading some of your papers, because I don't have the book yet, and seeing how you walk through France and then Italy and Germany, countries that I thought, okay, well, they've been democracies for a long time, France in particular, but they didn't get an A from you. So walk us through how they turn from C students into A students. Pick a country and tell us some of the evolution of
Well,
that.
so the classic case is France, simply because it's considered to be the home of modern democracy. So the first modern transition to democracy, or the first democratic experiment, occurs during the French Revolution, right? And that lasts for a very short period of time, and it quickly collapses into the Reign of Terror, which many historians consider to be the first totalitarian regime. So we have a rapid transition to democracy, followed by a rapid collapse of democracy into not just dictatorship, but totalitarianism. You know, at the end of the day, who comes out of the French Revolution? It's Napoleon. Probably we could characterize as the first military populist dictatorship, right? Now, France goes through so many transitions during the 19th century that there's a great joke that I use in my book. During the late 19th century, one quip in France had it that France changed political regimes so many times that they kept their constitutions in the periodical section. And again, transitions in 1848, transitions in 1871. The first time you get political stability in France after the revolution is with that Third Republic. And it's called the Third Republic because it was the third try at democracy since the French Revolution. That regime lasts until 1940, when it collapses under pressure from inside and, of course, from the invasion from Hitler. You then get a Fourth Republic after 1945, that collapses under pressure from inside and from the Algerian War. Then we get a Fifth Republic with de Gaulle. I'm exhausted because it's really tiring, and there's many other transitions in between that are not fully democracy versus dictatorship. And then you get stability in France after that Fifth Republic. So, I mean, think about the tumult there. Right. Now, if we were to go to cases like Italy and Germany, it would look even worse, right? Because those experiments in democracy, which happened during the interwar period, those don't just collapse into dictatorship. Those collapse in a big way, right? I mean, we're talking fascism and National Socialism. So, there's some pretty bad, pretty negative, pretty difficult history with democracy when you dig just below the surface in Europe.
Well, I think, again, my takeaway from the readings of you is that this tension's always there. In other words, you can't just say, we got an A in democracy, and then you put it on the shelf, right?
Right.
There's always tension, and there's always something, trying to erode that process. You talk about a tension between capitalism and democracy. So how does that play out?
So that's another great question. Up until 1945, again, the time when we got this template for stable liberal democracy in the West, which we began to just take for granted until we began to see problems over the last 10 or 15 years. Up until 1945, people also thought these two things couldn't go together, democracy and capitalism. And I will point out that this was true on both the left and the right. So on the left, the belief was, well, democracy and capitalism can't go together because the middle classes and the upper classes will never allow workers to get the vote, because if workers get the vote, they're going to insist on changes to social policy and economic policy that, again, the middle class and the upper class will not allow, right? So that was the left view. These are incompatible because the upper classes, the middle classes will never allow workers to actually gain power. Now on the right, actually, and among classical liberals, the view is actually the same but flipped, which is we can allow democracy because if we do, these crazy workers and socialists and communists will come to power and they will put in place changes that will threaten our material interests. So this was a relatively widespread view that these two things could not fit together. It was only after 1945, with the changes that happened in European and also during the New Deal North American political economies, that we began to all of a sudden believe, hey, capitalism and democracy go together pretty easily, and liberal democracy is something we can take for granted. This is really a product of 1945 and after, but we lived under this system for so many decades that we began to think about how difficult it was to actually get there and how potentially in tension these different elements could be.
Now, does the state of the economy mask problems? In other words, if people are having decent wages and decent jobs, they're not worrying about some of the undercurrents of what could be going wrong, and they're not looking at that stuff. And then does it jump up and bite them all of a sudden? How does this?
Well, so I mean, I think the first part of your question is important, right? Because one of the reasons why democracy and capitalism became compatible after 1945 is because you had this incredible period of decades where you had not just growth, but extremely equitable growth. And so what you had was not just an expanding pie, but an expanding pie that everybody got something from. And so the really terrible thing for democracy, and it's just another term for polarization, is when politics begins to seem zero-sum. Democracy does not work well under those conditions. And so when you have economic gains where one group thinks, okay, if that group gets something, I'm going to lose something, that is terrible for democracy. And so the genius of the post-war political economy was that you had growth, but it was distributed so that everybody felt they were benefiting from it. And this made, again, this lowered tensions, this made compromise easier, it eliminated this zero-sum mentality, and it diminished the appeal of radicals who said this system has to be fundamentally changed because it's not serving you or you. And so that's why that kind of growth, it's not just the growth, it's the distributed nature of the growth, was so important. And so what we've seen now is slower growth, and just as perniciously, more unequal growth that has also fed into declining social mobility. And so people now look around them and they do not see the benefits of the system trickling down to them, trickling down to their children, trickling down to their communities. And so they're very concerned about the future. They're very upset with politicians, and they're worried more generally about the future, and that creates very difficult conditions for democracy to thrive in.
So when you talk about France and some of these other countries, there's periods of great upheaval, and then maybe you improve on democracy, another great upheaval, improve on democracy. Can you go through a period like we're going through with all this dysfunction and polarization and not have a great upheaval before you get to the next level? Does history say you can do it without a revolutionary type of a movement occurring?
So there's lots of periods of gradual improvement. There's lots of periods of gradual decline. There's lots of periods where turmoil is purely negative, and there are periods where turmoil, in retrospect, turns out to be positive. So the question I think we're facing today is we're clearly in a period of turmoil. Lots of discontent, lots of unhappiness, lots of concern about democracy. So the question is, are we as a society going to be able to turn this challenge into an opportunity, or is it just going to promote further decay? I mean, I think that's really where we are today, figuring out where we're going to go and what those of us who favor liberal democracy and think it's the best system around, what we can do to turn this challenge into an opportunity to make our liberal democracy work even better.
And how much interplay was there, I know you've studied Europe a lot, between what was happening in France while something might have been happening in Italy or Germany? Are they interrelated, or are they kind of independent in that regard?
So that's a great question. Part of the reason why social scientists use terms like waves is because there are times in history when countries seem to move in unison, right? And so this clearly is one of those times. The trends that we're seeing in the US definitely are reflected in Western Europe. And so clearly we are in a period where there's sort of something, some of the causes of political problems are clearly general. Each country has their specific problems and their specific characteristics, but there's clearly something more generally going on in Europe and the United States. There are times, of course, when particular countries go off on their paths, but there are times in history when you seem to kind of see some kind of trends, zeitgeist, whatever. And clearly we are in one of those periods today, I would say in the West in particular.
And in Europe, I think the advent of the EU, which links them together economically, means that at some level of government, there's got to be
and politically, of course, too.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So one of the things you talk about is when governments invent technocrats and how that has an impact. I found that kind of fascinating. Walk us through why technocrats get invented and what's their impact on democracy.
So one of the many things that I think has happened over the last couple of decades that's been problematic is people have come to see their political institutions as less responsive. And in fact, they have become less responsive in many objective measures. One of the things that's happened, most notably in the EU, where there's been a very strong backlash against this trend, particularly since the financial crisis and with the refugee crisis, is against the idea that the people making decisions are not directly responsible to those who the decisions affect, right? So the idea is that it's EU technocrats and bureaucrats who are making decisions about economic policy, who are making decisions about refugees, and we don't have any way of controlling these people. They're making decisions without the sort of democratic linkages that people have come to expect as their right and their due. And so much of the backlash against Europe, right, is based on this, the idea that the EU is undemocratic and that the people making decisions, again, are technocrats or elites removed from the concerns of everyday people. The version of this in the United States, of course, is that elites are out of touch, right? They're not connected to voters. They don't have the same concerns. And that too much power, again, has been turned over to those who are not, again, responsive to the people, who are not of the people, and who therefore do not correctly mirror what their actual needs and concerns are.
No, that's huge. And I think there's other layers of that in our country that we're not feeling. So on our show, we like to talk about solutions, and you also wrote an article called The Lost Left. And I think you're suggesting that the left of the center movement, if that's the right word or something, is lost. And we need that back to create some balance. What's your theory in that regard?
So this is most clear in Europe, where the traditional parties of the center-left, Labour Party, Social Democratic parties, have just been eviscerated over the last couple of decades. They're no longer parties that are potential majority parties. They are no longer parties that can anchor stable governments. And this is crucial for a whole variety of reasons. The most obvious is the one I just said, which is you no longer have this option in many European countries of having this kind of alternation between a center-right government and a center-left government that differ in important ways policy-wise, but that can form stable governments capable of passing policies, putting forward relatively coherent programs, yada, yada, yada. That's no longer there. The other problem is that historically, or at least during the post-war period and even from the late 19th century on, is these parties, Labour parties, Social Democratic parties, these were historically the vehicles for the disenfranchised, the disaffected, those who felt that, the system was not working for them. And so what Social Democratic and Labour parties did was it took these people And it brought them into not only a well-organized political movement, but into the political system. And so that vehicle, so to speak, for translating the concerns and the demands of the disenfranchised and the disaffected, that has disappeared. And so what has replaced them...
Why did it disappear?
Well, so this is
happened?
a different question. I think what's happened to the left is that it is suffering from not having dealt very well with two of the main underlying structural trends that have helped to destabilize Western democracies: economic change and social change. So again, as I'm sure you've probably talked about in previous programs, we've had an incredible period of economic change over this last several decades. Again, we already mentioned manifestations of that: slow growth, inequitable growth, declining social mobility, much more risk in the labor market, much less steady jobs, growing role for technology. So all of these things have kind of been unleashed since kind of, let's say, the neoliberal wave of the 1970s. And basically what happened was, particularly from the late 1980s on, the center-left kind of bought into this and sort of offered, rather than a real alternative to these neoliberal changes, a kind of kinder, gentler version of it. And the problem with that is that once those things started to go south, particularly with the financial crisis, people thought to themselves, well, I'm upset with what's going on, but these parties no longer offer me a viable alternative to the existing system that I see right here. As for social issues, I think here too the left either didn't recognize or didn't want to recognize how incredibly destabilizing some of the cultural and social changes that had been going on since the late 20th century were. They made obviously a lot of people feel uncomfortable and disaffected, and without, again, the center-left speaking to those concerns in a way that could turn them, I think, back into progressive outlets, they festered and they got worse and they created lots of fear. And so they were there again to be mobilized by other parties who were willing to speak to them directly in extremely negative and threat-based kinds of ways. And so I think the center-left kind of really missed dealing with these two great challenges, and they were basically picked up and ran with by these populist parties, mostly of the right-wing variety.
So I don't know how much you've studied the Great Depression.
A lot.
A lot. Okay, there's a good answer. What are the parallels to the Great Recession that we just went through? And where are we in the story? I mean, is it a 2 or 3 act story, and are we in the second act? Because we're definitely going through some turbulent times here. Yep. But I don't know where we are in the story.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's also a great question. Look, I think the interwar period is a cautionary tale, right? We're not there yet, but it tells us what can happen if we allow all of these negative trends to continue, and if our political parties don't do a better job of responding to them. So as far as the Depression itself is concerned, that was a much, much more serious downturn than we have today. Levels of unemployment in the United States and in places like Germany were at 30%. Growth rates had plummeted. Wealth had been destroyed. So we're not there yet. Plus, of course, there wasn't anything resembling a welfare state to catch people. So we are not there yet. That level of suffering we have not approached. But the political and social ramifications of that suffering in the 1930s should keep us wary, right? Because when people suffer, they're willing to embrace radical solutions, right? So, let's be clear, as bad as our economic indicators are, they're not at Great Depression levels, but we don't want to let them become that way, because in desperate times, people are willing to accept desperate solutions. And by the way, FDR in the United States, when he fought the Depression, he understood that he was fighting a political as much as an economic fight. He very much understood that in addition to dealing with the terrible fallout of the economic depression, that what he was doing was that showing citizens, government can respond, we are here, we can tackle this, and he very much had the idea of strengthening democracy at a time when it was very much in decline in Europe, very much at the forefront of his thought when he implemented and proposed all of these policies that came to be known as the New Deal.
I guess one of my concerns is, you said, it didn't replicate in magnitude, but we have so much debt overhang and the fiscal, it's a very tenuous fiscal situation that if we had another hit, we don't have the tools to perhaps recover from it. So I was just wondering if we're in the middle of a story that plays out over the next 3 or 4 years when we have to look at that next recession. That's the scary thing to me, with it recovering from that aspect. One of the things you don't talk about in your papers, and maybe I just missed it because great papers, but how does leadership factor into these changes? When, if at all, do great leaders come at the time they need to come to force solutions? Or do the scenarios force great leaders to come? So where does leadership, if at all, play into this? So, and by the way, you mentioned FDR, obviously a great leader. So.
Yes, that's a great question, and it's a little hard to answer because one doesn't know when great men and great women exactly are going to stride on the scene. I will say, though, that I think one thing we can learn from history is that times of crises highlight the importance of leadership. I think in normal times, whatever those are, great leaders are both less necessary and less important. Times of crises are times when A, people are really looking for change and desperate for it, and B, the situation is more fluid. Things that had become accepted are now being questioned. And so it's at times of crises, I think, when leaders are most important. They can be most important in a positive way, FDR, strengthen democracy. Negative way, Hitler comes in and destroys what remains of German democracy. So I think what we can say is that leadership is most impactful at times of crises. Doesn't mean that great leaders can't make a difference in other times, but if you think about the great leaders that come to mind both in the negative and positive sense, FDR, Hitler, Bismarck, de Gaulle, these were people who strode on the historical scene at a time when, again, things were much more fluid and open, and so they could have their greatness flourish, so to speak.
I know we talked to Mike Abramowitz yesterday from the Freedom House, and he was talking about the decline of democracy, and he was hinting that it's going to have a report come out today, and we have time for perhaps one last issue here quickly. You read that report. What did they learn that's new that we need to understand?
Right, so there was a great survey that came out today that was commissioned by actually institutes associated with former President Bush, former President Obama, and Joe Biden. So they're clearly making a statement. All of them are concerned about the state of democracy. So the big findings are lots of Americans are concerned. A majority of Americans are very worried about the future of democracy and think that it's possible, actually, that the United States' democracy may decline in some significant ways over the coming years. The more positive finding is that most Americans still favor democracy. So they favor it and they think that it is extremely important for the U.S. to remain a democracy at the same time that they are concerned about the direction it is headed. So those, I think, are two interesting findings. One, very concerning. One, something that we can build on. And the two key reasons why people gave for being concerned about the state of democracy are money in politics and racial discrimination. So for those who are asked, why are you worried or why are you dissatisfied, those were the two most oft given answers.
Well, thank you. You've been a great guest.
Thank you.
Time always flies because I have so much fun while I'm doing this. And come back to Aspen again. We'll have you on again.
I hope I can. Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening to today's show. Our goal is always to educate, and we want you to have some fun, and we want to talk about solutions. I started the show by talking about if you don't learn the lessons of history, you're doomed to repeat them. And when Sherri's book comes out, take a look at it, or take a look at some of her articles, because there are some very serious lessons of history. And I think we're going through a fascinating time right now. As I said during the interview, I don't know if we're in the first inning or the eighth inning or the 10th hole or the 18th hole, whatever the analogy is for you. I don't know, but we're living through it. But you've got to get involved. You can't just be a spectator in this activity. You've got to be a participant in this. As we said during an interview yesterday, this is a participatory democracy. You don't sit back and let democracy happen. Because if you do, as Professor Burnham said, you wake up one day and it's gone, and then you've got to fight to get it back. Let's not have to fight to get it back. Let's get involved. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.